So at the time that I'm recording this, it would appear that Starship is going to have to wait even longer before it takes off from Boca Chica. The spaceflight community is going to have to wait longer to see the most powerful and ambitious rocket in human history take to flight. And to be honest, this should come as a surprise to nobody. We really need to look at the scope of what SpaceX is trying to do here. Like it or not, SpaceX is trying to create a duplicate of Cape Canaveral all the way in South Texas. Think about it for a moment. We're talking about a rocket that ultimately is going to have a very aggressive launch cadence. It will have to have an aggressive launch cadence in order to be able to be functional. Even if it is also taking off from Cape Canaveral, it's going to ultimately need to have quite a few launches from Boca Chica in order for this launch site to be useful. And at the same time, there's already a protected environmental area and a public beach in the region. This is not an easy thing to get approved. This is not just some kind of small-scale test facility. This is a facility that needs to be built to launch the biggest rocket that's ever been launched, by far. And by the way, as I'm recording this, the announcement from the FAA had been rolled back and removed from their website. However, in my opinion, they're just doing a little bit of website maintenance or something. I can't imagine that they posted something this important and just made a giant mistake. Instead, we can expect May 31st as being the earliest date that the FAA is going to release anything on Starship. Extremely disappointing, but at the same time, Starship may not be ready until considerably after that anyway. The Raptor 2 and a mature version of the booster may not be ready until the fall, and perhaps even later than that, if you believe my opinion on the subject. This is an incredibly ambitious project, and we should treat it as such. And speaking of ambitious projects, what about returning Americans to the ISS using American spacecraft? Oh yeah, that's already been done, hasn't it? Well, Boeing is still trying to do it, and as of next month, they're going to give it another shot. But that having been said, do we really need Starliner? Is Starliner really important to the American space program at this point? After all, in the past with the shuttle, we only had one method of transporting astronauts to orbit or to the ISS. Do we really need two methods at this point, now that Crew Dragon has proven itself so well? And Starliner has been fraught with all kinds of issues anyway. Couldn't we just bring this process to a conclusion rather than spend more money on it? Well, given Starliner's past, many details of which I haven't talked about yet, there are some very good reasons that we should consider bringing this program to a halt for good. As many of you know, the first video that I ever created for this channel, at least as far as spaceflight is concerned, was about the orbital test of Starliner, which took place all the way back in December of 2019. The test, as all of us know, was an abject failure. At least it didn't blow up on the pad or anything along those lines. As a matter of fact, the Atlas V performed its task to perfection. It was the Starliner Starliner itself that had serious issues one after another. But it's not just the issues that are concerning me about Starliner, it's also Boeing's entire corporate strategy in getting this spacecraft rammed down NASA's throat, especially given the fact that NASA paid Boeing substantially more money than they paid SpaceX to develop Crew Dragon. Now, the technical issues were bad enough. 30 minutes after liftoff, when Starliner was supposed to go into orbit, a series of software failures led the capsule to believe that it was in a different phase of the mission, and its suite of onboard thrusters started to fire in a haphazard fashion, expending huge amounts of fuel. Now, NASA recognized this problem quickly and tried to communicate with the spacecraft to solve the problem, and another glitch, an unexpected communications blackout, prevented mission control from fixing the spacecraft. So Starliner got into a shallow orbit, the wrong orbit obviously, and Boeing and NASA made the quick decision to bring the spacecraft back. But in retrospect, it's a damn good thing that that glitch happened in the first place, because it led to Boeing doing an exhaustive check of the Starliner systems, and while they were doing that, they found another software glitch that was going to cause the capsule service module to crash into the capsule during re-entry, and so they had to frantically patch that software glitch before the problem occurred. If that had not happened, if the first glitch had not occurred, Boeing would have had no reason to check into these problems, and the spacecraft would have been destroyed. Fortunately, there was nobody on board. The question remains, of course, how many other problems exist on this capsule aside from the ones that were immediately apparent during the test? Well, obviously, NASA was extremely concerned about this. They put together an independent team of veteran engineers to investigate it, and they recommended 80 different fixes, 61 to the software and 19 to the capsule's communication systems. That is a hell of a lot of corrections made to a capsule that was theoretically ready to carry human beings. But the problems with the 2019 test flight were only the latest in a series of issues with Starliner that had caused NASA a huge number of headaches. Way back in 2016, Boeing asked NASA to raise the amount that they were being paid to develop Starliner in the first place. They threatened actually to pull out of the commercial crew project if they did not receive an additional $287 million. Money for problems that they themselves had actually created. But Boeing demanded this money, and at the time, NASA had no guarantee that Crew Dragon, being made by SpaceX, who at the time was a relatively untried and untested company, was going to be able to develop a capsule on the timeline that they needed it completed. So Boeing, in essence, had NASA over a barrel, or at least it appeared that way in 2016, so they got their $287 million. And in 2019, the NASA Inspector General actually investigated Boeing and that entire transaction under a fraud investigation. Yes, NASA suspected Boeing of fraud, given how serious that negotiation was and how ruthless Boeing was in demanding that huge amount of money from NASA for something that they were actually responsible for. But it got worse than that. After Boeing Starliner was delayed time and again, it became clear that NASA was going to need more Soyuz seats in order to be able to continue flying to the ISS. So did they buy Soyuz seats from Roscosmos? No, they bought them from Boeing. Does that make a damn bit of sense to you? But that is indeed what happened. 5 days after NASA awarded Boeing the extra $287 million that they essentially had been strong-armed into giving them, then Boeing bought 5 seats on the Soyuz and resold those seats to NASA for $374 million. Subsequent to all of this fishiness, the Office of Inspector General decided to investigate potential fraud on the part of Boeing and their allies at NASA. After an extensive investigation, they determined that the contracts were valid and less than optimal, obviously, and not very well administered, but not intentionally fraudulent. I still have my doubts about that, but that is what the Office of Inspector General concluded. However, this isn't the only example of fishy relations between Boeing and NASA. In 2020, as many of us may remember, during the whole HLS contract debate, Boeing received unfair inside information from NASA's Human Exploration Chief Doug Lavero, who incidentally resigned shortly after this came to light. He should not have shared this information with Boeing, and it gave them an unfair advantage in the whole HLS competition. Obviously, Boeing did not win this competition, but given all of the fishy stuff that had been going on between Boeing and NASA, Boeing reached an agreement that forced the company to carry out a private review of its ethics culture. Boeing also fired an in-house attorney and a few employees over this. So here's the question. With all of this crooked behavior on the part of Boeing and their incredibly important responsibilities to NASA and to the American space program, and indeed mankind's future in the solar system, because they're taking care of SLS as well, why the hell does NASA want to keep doing business with them, especially on Starliner, when they already have a perfectly good ship to take astronauts to the ISS? And it gets even worse. When the Starliner does become operational, assuming that it becomes operational, they're going to be charging $90 million per seat for NASA to fly astronauts to the ISS versus $55 million per seat from SpaceX. So it's going to be costing NASA an extra $35 million a seat, or $140 million per mission, just to use this thing. Why? Well, one important reason has only come to light recently, and that is the whole matter of ISS reboost. And no matter what anybody tells you, in its current configuration, Crew Dragon is not going to have enough fuel left by the time it reaches the ISS in order to be able to conduct reboost with its Super Draco engines. The Super Dracos are also not properly positioned in order to be able to give an effective reboost to the ISS anyway. Additional engines would need to be added probably in the trunk, along with additional fuel, in order to make this possible. Starliner, on the other hand, was specifically designed for ISS reboost, with additional fuel and engines being carried inside the service module. So that's one advantage, one of the very few that the Starliner has. But given the fact that we can no longer really rely on Roscosmos to provide reboost to the ISS, something that they've been almost exclusively responsible for 20 years, that's something that needs to be seriously considered. And now the Cygnus resupply ship isn't going to be a realistic replacement for reboost either, even though the most recent Cygnus has modifications that theoretically will allow it to perform an effective reboost of the ISS. There are no rockets to carry it up to the ISS anymore, and that's simply because the Antares rocket utilizes both Russian and Ukrainian components, and we only have 2 of those left. So there's a limited number of Cygnus ships that are going to be making the journey to the ISS in the future. That is problematic in itself, but on top of that, we don't have any active vessels that are going to be able to carry out reboost of the ISS on an ongoing basis, aside from Starliner, or there's one other alternative, and that of course is the Dream Chaser. Dream Chaser in its current configuration is not designed to carry human beings. However, it is capable of ISS reboost, and together with its Shooting Star module can deliver up to 5,500 kilograms of pressurized pressurized and unpressurized cargo to the space station. Now, on top of this, the Dream Chaser was originally designed to carry crew. It was part of the commercial crew program and was unwisely discarded by NASA in favor of Boeing and all of their fishy business dealings. But that aside, Dream Chaser was, as I said, originally designed to carry human crew and would require minor modifications, relatively speaking, in order to be able to carry crew members itself. So, in my opinion, NASA should be heavily investing in Dream Chaser as a permanent replacement for Starliner, given all the problems that Starliner has already had. I mean, think about it for a moment. We're talking about 2 different errors during its initial test, either one of which could have led to the destruction of the spacecraft, on top of 80 corrective measures that needed to be taken in order to permanently correct these problems, and then, unbelievably, when the problems were technically corrected, Starliner had more problems. Half of its valves, or nearly half of its valves, experienced a malfunction that they were never able to fix. Now, modifications have been made to the service module and to the valves, apparently to prevent moisture from entering them. That seems to be what caused the problem with the valves in the first place. I can't believe that Boeing actually designed a space capsule that was that vulnerable to moisture, especially if you're launching from Cape Canaveral, for God's sake. If we're talking about a place that has a hell of a lot of moisture, I can't think of a worse place than Florida. And yet, apparently, that's what caused the problems with the valves, or at least that's Boeing's best guess. It is difficult to comprehend all of the things that have happened since this moment back in 2019, where everybody was feeling optimistic, where it really did seem like a race between Crew Dragon and Starliner as to who was going to return astronauts to the ISS first. SpaceX had that anomaly with the Crew Dragon that they had performed their unmanned test with and blown it sky high, and it looked like that investigation was going to take a little while, and in the meantime, Starliner had a huge opportunity to come through, but it didn't. Instead, it experienced so many problems, any one of which could have led to the destruction of the spacecraft, and then after 2 years of working on it, it still had a hell of a lot of problems which further delayed the spacecraft from July of 2021 until May 19th at the earliest of 2022. Unbelievable and unacceptable, especially given the tarnished background of this spacecraft. All of the crooked business dealings, the overcharging, the cost per seat, and all of the technical problems combined. Does NASA really want to use this spacecraft on an ongoing basis? The only argument that might currently exist to use Starliner on a temporary basis is simply because we don't have a backup for Crew Dragon. If anything happens to Crew Dragon, we have no way of getting our astronauts to the ISS. So once again, unbelievably, Boeing has NASA over a barrel. Regardless of what NASA may think about Starliner, regardless of how much confidence they may have lost in Boeing, they really don't have a choice. Either go with Starliner or take a risk of there being some kind of future anomaly with Crew Dragon and the Russians taking control of the ISS until we can correct the problem. That's something that NASA, I'm sure, doesn't want to face, and a problem that they wouldn't have to face if they had simply started to invest in Dream Chaser when these problems with Starliner became apparent back in 2019. Hell, they might have started to invest in Dream Chaser when Boeing had them over a barrel back in 2016 and were demanding almost $300 million in additional funding. Now, just to be perfectly clear, I am in no way condemning the engineers or their family members or anybody else that you just looked at in that previous film. I think that Boeing has a great deal of individual talent. I just think that they have bad leadership and bad oversight and a bad corporate philosophy that has led to the production of a bad space capsule. And sadly, it may also have resulted in a bad moon rocket as well. Time will tell. But in the meantime, NASA really needs to start working aggressively on an alternative to Starliner. There have simply been too many problems, too many glitches, and too many technical and engineering failures with this project to continue with it and to make it such an important part of NASA's future plans. It just isn't worth the risk, and NASA needs to be working on contingency plans now rather than later. Don't forget the 100K challenge and the opportunity to see SpaceX fanboy get tattooed on my posterior. And also, if you want to support this channel and see more of my content, check out the description. There's lots of ways to do that. So until NASA has a reasonable and solid replacement, or alternative that is, for Crew Dragon, something put out by a company that has a solid technical record and a solid code of ethics, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.